My son wrote, "Don't expect me to take care of you in old age. I have my own life and family." I said nothing and silently rewrote my will. The next morning, he burst into my house and, "Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Margaret Ellen Whitfield, and I am 71 years old. I have lived in the same house on Clover Creek Road for 38 years. The white colonial with the green shutters and the rose bushes. My late husband, Gerald, planted the spring before he died. People on our street knew that house. They knew me. They knew the smell of my apple pie drifting through the screen door on Sunday afternoons, and they knew the sound of my wind chimes when the Tennessee breeze came through in October. That house was not just a building. It was the proof that I had lived, that I had loved, that I had survived. Gerald died 11 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 14 weeks from diagnosis to the last breath. After that, it was just me and the memory of everything we had built together. The savings, the property, the small rental house on Birchwood Avenue that Gerald had purchased as an investment in 1998. We had no daughters. We had one son, Daniel. For a long time, I told myself that Daniel was a good man who had simply become busy. That is what mothers do. We translate neglect into busyness, indifference into stress, coldness into exhaustion. Daniel was 44 years old, worked in commercial real estate in Nashville, and had been married for 9 years to a woman named Tara. Tara was polished in the way that certain women are polished. Smooth surface, no warmth underneath. She wore expensive blouses and spoke about money the way other people speak about the weather. Constantly, casually, as though it required no particular sensitivity. They had 2 children, my grandchildren, Mason, 7, and Lily, 5. I adored those children, and that adoration, I would later understand, was used against me like a key in a lock. The first thing that should have warned me happened 2 Christmases ago. I had prepared the house for the holiday, the tree, the stockings, the dinner that took me 2 days to cook. Daniel and Tara arrived 3 hours late. Tara walked through the front door, glanced around the living room, and said, without lowering her voice, "Daniel, we really need to talk about this house. The upkeep alone must be costing her a fortune." She said it as though I were not standing 4 feet away, as though I were already gone. I said nothing. I served the dinner. I watched Tara cut Lily's turkey and speak to Daniel in that low, deliberate way she had, the way that meant a conversation had already happened, privately, before they arrived. The second warning came in the spring. Daniel called me on a Tuesday evening, unusual because Daniel rarely called without a reason attached to it, and asked very casually whether I had ever considered a reverse mortgage on Clover Creek Road. I asked him why. He said he was just thinking about my financial security. I said my financial security was fine. There was a pause. Then he said, "Mom, you should be realistic about the future." I told him I was very realistic. We hung up. After that call, I began to notice things I had previously explained away. The way Tara always steered conversations toward the rental property on Birchwood Avenue. The questions about my will, never direct, always wrapped in concern. "Have you updated your documents, Mom? You really should have everything in order." The way Daniel began to visit more frequently that summer, but each visit felt less like a son checking on his mother and more like an inspection. I was not a foolish woman. I had taught high school English for 26 years. I had read enough literature to recognize the shape of a story while it was still forming. But I still was not prepared for what came in September. It was a Sunday evening. The light was going amber through the kitchen window, the way it does in Tennessee in early fall. I had made soup, chicken, and wild rice. And Daniel had come over alone, without Tara or the children. We sat at the kitchen table, and for a few minutes it felt almost like it used to, like he was still just my son. Then he put down his spoon. He looked at me across the table, and his face changed. Not into cruelty, exactly, but into something harder, something decided. And he said the words that I will never forget for the rest of my life. "Mom, I need you to understand something. Don't you dare count on me in your old age. I have my own life. I have my own family. What happens to you is not my responsibility." The kitchen was very quiet. The soup was still warm. Outside, a car passed slowly on Clover Creek Road. I did not answer him. I looked at my son, at the face I had held in my hands the day he was born, and I said nothing at all. I simply nodded, once, and looked back down at my bowl. He left 20 minutes later, seemingly satisfied that he had handled something efficiently. The door clicked shut behind him, and I sat alone at my kitchen table until the soup went cold. That night, I slept very little. But by morning, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I woke at 5:15 that Monday morning to the sound of the mockingbird that lived in the oak tree by the back fence. Gerald had loved that bird. He used to say it was the most honest creature in the neighborhood because it never pretended to be only one thing. I lay still in bed for a long while, looking at the ceiling. My chest felt heavy, not from grief exactly, but from the particular exhaustion of finally seeing something clearly that you had been avoiding for a very long time. I thought about money first, because money was what this was actually about. Gerald had left everything to me, and everything was not insignificant. The house on Clover Creek Road had been appraised the previous year at $412,000. The rental property on Birchwood Avenue brought in $1,400 a month and was valued at around $220,000. My savings, the combined result of Gerald's life insurance, 30 years of careful living, and my own teacher's pension, sat in accounts totaling just over $180,000. I also had Gerald's old truck, my own car, and the contents of a house filled with 38 years of accumulated life. In total, I was sitting on assets worth close to $800,000. And my son had just told me, to my face, at my kitchen table, that I was not his responsibility. I got up, made coffee, and sat in Gerald's chair by the front window. The wingback armchair he had reupholstered himself the year before he got sick. I held my mug with both hands, and I did what I had always done when I needed to think clearly. I made a list in my head. What did I fear? I feared incapacity. I feared a future in which I was vulnerable and dependent on a man who had just declared himself indifferent to that vulnerability. I feared Tara, her cold arithmetic, her way of looking at this house like it was already an asset to be liquidated. I feared that if I did nothing, I would spend the last years of my life slowly transferring everything I had worked for into the hands of people who had already decided I was a burden before I had even become one. What did I know for certain? I knew that my current will, drawn up 8 years ago, left the entirety of my estate to Daniel. I knew that I had never questioned this, because 8 years ago I had still believed he was the son I thought I had raised. I knew that a will is not a promise. It is a document, and documents can be changed. What could I do? I could do quite a lot, actually. The first thing I decided, sitting in Gerald's chair with the morning light coming pale through the curtains, was that I would call my attorney. His name was Warren Holt, and he had handled Gerald's estate and drawn up my original will. He was 70 years old, semi-retired, absolutely trustworthy, and he had known me for 15 years. I would call Warren, and I would ask him to review my options. The second thing I decided was that I would not tell Daniel. Not yet. Not until everything was in order and there was nothing left to argue about. The third thing, and this one came to me slowly, like something surfacing from deep water, was that I would not simply rewrite my will to exclude Daniel and leave it blank. I would rewrite it with intention. I would think carefully about who deserved what I had built, and I would make choices that reflected my actual values, not the obligation I had simply inherited by being someone's mother. I thought about the people in my life who had shown up without being asked. My neighbor Dorothy, who had brought groceries to my door during the worst week of my grief after Gerald died, and never once mentioned it again. My former student James, who had grown up to work with a local literacy nonprofit, and who called me every few months just to say hello and to tell me which books he was reading. My church, which ran a food pantry every Thursday morning and never seemed to have quite enough. My niece Claire, Gerald's sister's daughter, who was 37, raising 2 kids alone after a divorce, working as a nurse, and who had sent me a handwritten birthday card every single year without fail. These people existed. They were real, and they had never once looked at me and calculated my net worth. By 8 o'clock that morning, I had finished my coffee and my thinking. I was not hysterical. I was not bitter in the burning, poisonous way. I was something quieter and more durable than that. I was decided. I picked up the phone and called Warren Holt's office. His assistant, a cheerful young woman named Patrice, told me Warren had an opening Thursday at 2 o'clock. I said Thursday at 2 was perfect. Then I went to the kitchen, poured myself a second cup of coffee, and began for the first time in months to feel something that surprised me with its steadiness. I felt calm. Thursday came with the kind of steady gray sky that Tennessee sometimes produces in September. Not threatening, just settled, as though the weather itself had made a decision and was sticking to it. I dressed carefully. Not formally. I was not going to court. But with the quiet intention of a woman who wants to be taken seriously. Dark slacks, my good cream blouse, the small pearl earrings Gerald had given me for our 25th anniversary. Warren Holt's office was on the second floor of a brick building on Commerce Street in downtown Franklin. The waiting area smelled of old paper and coffee, which I had always found reassuring. Patrice waved me in at 2 o'clock exactly. Warren was a broad, slow-moving man with white hair and the careful manner of someone who had spent decades listening to families in distress without letting their distress become his own. He stood when I entered, shook my hand with both of his, and gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Margaret," he said, "it's good to see you, though I suspect this isn't a social call." "It isn't," I said, and I told him everything. I told him about the reverse mortgage question in the spring, about Tara's comments at Christmas, about the escalating pattern of inquiries about my estate, and I told him, plainly and without drama, exactly what Daniel had said to me at the kitchen table 9 days ago. Warren listened without interrupting. He took 1 or 2 notes. When I finished, he folded his hands on the desk and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as unsurprised. "You have every right to restructure your estate plan however you see fit," he said. "In Tennessee, you are under no legal obligation to leave anything to an adult child. Your assets are yours. The will reflects your wishes, and your wishes have apparently changed." "They have," I said. We spent the next 90 minutes going through my options in detail. Warren explained the mechanics clearly. What changes I could make to the will itself, what assets I might want to place in a living trust to ensure they transferred outside of probate, whether I should consider naming a non-family executor to remove any potential for contestation. He was thorough and unhurried, and when we were finished, I had a clear picture of what the next steps would look like. I left his office at 3:40 with a folder of notes and an appointment to return the following Tuesday to sign revised documents. On the drive home, my phone rang. It was Daniel. I let it go to voicemail. He called again 20 minutes later when I was pulling into my driveway. I let that one go as well. The messages I listened to inside the house with my coat still on. The first message was casual, almost artificially so. "Hey, Mom, just checking in. Give me a call when you get a chance." The second was less casual. "Mom, I ran into Warren Holt's assistant today at the coffee shop on 5th. Patrice, she mentioned you had an appointment. Is everything okay? Call me." I stood in my hallway and replayed that second message twice. Franklin was a small town. That was simply true, and I could not hold it against Patrice for making innocent conversation. But Daniel's reaction to the information, the speed of it, the second call, the careful phrasing, told me something important. It told me that he understood immediately what a visit to an estate attorney might mean, which meant he had been thinking about my estate all along. I did not call him back. But the next morning, something happened that turned suspicion into evidence. I had given Daniel a spare key to my house years ago for emergencies. I had never thought twice about it. That Friday morning, I left the house at 9 to have breakfast with Dorothy at the diner on Main, and I returned at 11 to find something wrong in my study. Nothing was missing. But things had been moved. My filing cabinet, the gray 2-drawer one where I kept financial documents, insurance papers, Gerald's old tax returns, was not fully closed. The bottom drawer had a faint gap, and inside, I could see that the hanging folders were slightly disturbed, as though someone had gone through them quickly and not quite replaced them in the right order. I stood in the doorway of my study and looked at those files for a long time. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I walked to the kitchen, sat down, and thought about what this meant. Someone had been in my house while I was at breakfast. Someone who had a key. Someone who, after hearing I had visited an estate attorney, had decided they needed to know more. Specifically, what documents I kept. Perhaps what my current will said. Perhaps what my accounts contained. The point of no return, people call it. The moment when you understand that what you feared is not paranoia, but reality. This was that moment. I called Warren that afternoon and told him to make the new documents his absolute priority. I also asked him quietly whether I should change my locks. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Change your locks." I called a locksmith before I hung up with Warren. The new locks were installed by 4 o'clock that Friday afternoon. I put Daniel's old key in a kitchen drawer underneath the dish towels, and I did not touch it again. Tuesday came. I drove back to Warren's office on Commerce Street with the quiet focus of someone completing a task they have already fully decided upon. There was no drama in it for me by then. No trembling hands. No tearful second-guessing. I had spent the weekend in a state of unusual stillness, going about my ordinary routines with the particular peace that comes when a long internal argument has finally reached its conclusion. Warren had the revised documents prepared. We went through them together, carefully, line by line, because Warren was that kind of attorney, the kind who made sure you understood what you were signing, not just that you were signing it. The new will left the house on Clover Creek Road and its contents to my niece Claire, with the provision that she could sell or occupy as she chose. The rental property on Birchwood Avenue I placed in a living trust, with the income designated to support the local literacy nonprofit where James volunteered and directed. A bequest structured so that it would operate for a minimum of 15 years before the principal could be touched. My savings were divided. A substantial portion to Claire outright, a meaningful gift to Dorothy, and the remainder to my church's food pantry endowment fund. Daniel received nothing. That was not an accident or an oversight. It was a decision, and it was documented as such. I also named Warren himself as executor, removing any family member from that role entirely. I signed everything at 2:17 in the afternoon. Warren witnessed it. Patrice notarized it. The documents went into Warren's safe. I drove home feeling lighter than I had in years. The call came that evening at 7:15. It was Tara, not Daniel. Tara. Which told me something right away about who was actually managing this situation. Her voice was controlled, but there was an edge underneath it, like a table with one leg slightly shorter than the others. She said she and Daniel were concerned about me. She said they had heard I had been meeting with an attorney, and they were worried I might be making decisions that I would regret. She said, and I noted the exact phrasing, that any changes I made to my estate planning could create serious complications for the family going forward. I let her finish. Then I said calmly, "Tara, I appreciate your concern. My legal affairs are in order. Good night." I ended the call. 20 minutes later, Daniel called. His tone was different from Tara's. Less polished, more pressured, the way he used to sound when he was a teenager who had done something wrong and was trying to argue his way out of it. He said he needed to come over and talk. I said that wasn't necessary. He said he was worried about my mental state. I said my mental state was excellent. He said that elderly people sometimes made financial decisions that didn't reflect their true intentions, and that he was only trying to protect me. I recognized this immediately for what it was: the beginning of a narrative, a story being constructed about my competence. And I felt the first cold edge of genuine alarm. But I did not let him hear it. "Daniel," I said, "I am 71 years old and I taught English for 26 years. I understand language very well, including the language people use when they are trying to build a case. Don't call me again tonight." And I hung up. The next morning, Daniel arrived at my door at 8:45. He knocked. I did not answer. He tried his key and found, of course, that it no longer worked. He knocked again, louder. I stood in my hallway, 6 feet from the door, and did not move. "Mom?" His voice through the door was tight. "Mom, I know you're in there. Open the door. We need to talk." I said, clearly and loudly enough for him to hear, "If you have something to say to me, you can call Warren Holt. He is my attorney and my executor. Good morning, Daniel." There was a long silence. Then I heard his footsteps on the porch, and then the sound of his car starting and pulling away. I stood in the hallway for a moment after he left, and I noticed that my heart was beating faster than normal. That was honest. That was real. He was still my son, and standing 4 feet away from his voice while refusing to open the door was not a small thing. But I had done it. I called Dorothy that afternoon and asked if I could come for dinner. She said, of course, immediately, without asking why, which was one of the 10,000 reasons I loved her. I spent the evening at her kitchen table eating roast chicken and talking about her garden and her grandchildren and a novel she had just finished. And by the time I drove home that night, I felt like myself again. I gave myself the rest of the week. I read. I tended my rose bushes. I sat in Gerald's chair in the mornings. I let myself be quiet for a few days before whatever came next. The following week on a Wednesday, I received a card in the mail. A card? Not an email, not a text, but an actual card in a cream-colored envelope, addressed in Tara's handwriting. The front had a photograph of autumn leaves. Inside, in Tara's neat, controlled script, it read, "We have been thinking about you and we miss you. We would love to take you to dinner this weekend, just the 4 of us, you, Daniel, and the children. Lily has been asking for her grandmother. We hope you'll let us make things right. With love, Tara and Daniel." I read it twice. Then I set it on the kitchen counter and made myself a cup of tea. Lily asking for her grandmother. I want you to understand what that sentence was designed to do. It was designed to locate the one pressure point that I had not yet fully armored: my grandchildren. Mason and Lily were not responsible for any of this. They were 7 and 5 years old. They were innocent of everything. And Tara knew, she had always known, that they were the door through which I could be moved. I thought about Lily's face, her gap-toothed smile, the way she called me Grammy Maggie and insisted on sitting in my lap even when she was technically too big for it. I sat with that feeling for a long while. I did not push it away or pretend it wasn't there. That would have been dishonest, and I had decided some time ago that I was going to be honest with myself about everything from this point forward. Then I thought about something Warren had said to me in our first meeting. Margaret, people who have decided you owe them something will use whatever door you leave open. The card went into the recycling bin. I did not call, I did not write back, I did not accept the dinner invitation. 2 days later, Daniel texted me directly. The message was longer this time, and it had shifted register. Instead of pressure, it offered apology. He said he had spoken harshly. He said he was under a lot of stress at work. He said he hadn't meant it the way it sounded, and that, of course, he cared about me. He said he would like to come over, alone, just to talk, just the two of them. No agenda. No agenda. I had been a teacher for 26 years. I knew what it meant when someone told you there was no agenda. It meant there was very much an agenda. I replied with 4 words. I'll be in touch. I was not in touch. What I did instead was this. I called James. James Cooper was 39 now. And when I had taught him sophomore English at Franklin High, he had been a quiet boy who read everything and said very little in class, but left essays on my desk that I still thought about decades later. We had stayed loosely connected over the years, occasional emails, those phone calls every few months. I called him that Thursday and asked if I could come see the literacy center where he worked. He said he'd love that. He said Friday morning was perfect. The center was on a side street downtown, 3 rooms in a converted storefront with a small library, a reading corner for children, and a volunteer tutoring program for adults who were working toward their GED. James gave me a tour with the quiet pride of someone who has built something real and knows it. We had coffee afterward in the little office in the back, and I told him, not everything, not the legal specifics, but the shape of it, that I was making some changes to how I wanted my assets to be used after I was gone, and that his organization was part of those plans. James was quiet for a moment. Then he said simply, "Miss Margaret, you don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to," I said. "That's why I want to." He didn't make a speech about it. He didn't become overwhelmed or effusive. He just nodded and said thank you, in the way that people say thank you when they mean it entirely. And that was enough. On the way home, I stopped at Claire's apartment. She was between shifts at the hospital, still in her scrubs, feeding her 2 kids, Owen, 9, and Sophie, 6. A very rushed lunch of grilled cheese sandwiches. I sat at her small kitchen table and watched the ordinary chaos of her afternoon. And when the children had run off to do whatever children run off to do, I told Claire, carefully and plainly, that I had revised my estate documents and that she should know she was in them. Claire put down her coffee cup and looked at me. "Aunt Margaret, I don't want a conversation about it," I said. "I just wanted you to know. You've always shown up. That matters." Her eyes filled. She didn't say much more than thank you, and I told her she was welcome, and we talked about Owen's soccer team for 20 minutes, which was exactly the right thing to do. I drove home on the back roads through the gold and rust October countryside, and I thought, this is what I am protecting. This ordinary, imperfect, real life. Not some imagined future, not the performance of family, the actual thing. And I was not going to surrender it. They came on a Saturday morning, 9 days after the card. I was in the backyard with my coffee and my gardening gloves, cutting back the rose bushes for the autumn, when I heard the car in the driveway. I knew the sound of Daniel's car the way you know certain sounds that have been part of your life for decades. The particular engine note, the way the door closed with slightly more force than necessary. I set down my shears and waited. Daniel came around the side of the house with Mason and Lily. He had brought the children. Of course he had. Lily ran to me immediately, arms out, and I held her. I want to be clear about this. I held her completely. I let myself feel how much I loved her, because that was the truth, and pretending otherwise would have made me smaller, not stronger. Mason hung back a little in the way that boys his age do, trying to seem casual, but he allowed me to hug him too, and he squeezed back harder than he probably intended. Daniel stood watching this with an expression I recognized. Calculated tenderness. The expression of a man who has placed his children between himself and a consequence. "Mom," he said, "can we come in?" I looked at him over Lily's head. "The children can come in," I said. "We can talk out here." His jaw tightened, but he nodded. I brought the children inside and settled them in the living room with the basket of old picture books and puzzles I kept for their visits. Then I came back outside. Tara was standing by the garden gate now. She had been in the car, I realized, letting Daniel lead the approach. She was dressed carefully, as always. A dove-gray jacket, her hair smooth. She came forward when she saw me, and her face arranged itself into an expression of gentle concern. "Margaret," she said. She never called me Mom. I had noticed that early in the marriage. "We've been so worried. We feel terrible about how things have gotten. We just want to talk, honestly, as a family." "All right," I said. I did not sit down. I stood near the rose bushes with my gardening gloves still in my hand. What followed was approximately 40 minutes of the most artful manipulation I have ever personally witnessed, and I have read a great deal of literature. Tara spoke first and longest. She acknowledged that Daniel had said something hurtful. She framed it as a moment of weakness under stress. His firm had been going through restructuring, she explained, and he had been carrying a great deal of pressure that he hadn't known how to express. She said that of course they intended to be there for me as I got older, that family was everything to them, that none of this reflected how they truly felt. Her voice was warm, her hands were folded, her eyes were steady. It was, I thought, an excellent performance. Then she shifted, almost imperceptibly, to the point of the visit. She said she understood I had met with my attorney recently, and she said she hoped I hadn't made any, her word, drastic decisions under emotional distress. She said that estate planning done in a moment of pain sometimes created complications that couldn't be undone. She said that she and Daniel only wanted to make sure I had thought everything through clearly, with a full picture of what my choices might mean for the family. There it was. Daniel nodded along to everything Tara said, with the earnest agreement of a man who has been thoroughly briefed. And then he added something of his own, something that struck me as more genuinely felt than anything Tara had scripted. He said he remembered how hard I had worked my whole life. He said he remembered sitting at that same kitchen table as a boy, watching me grade papers late into the night. He said he didn't want to see everything I had built go to strangers. I looked at him for a long moment. There was, somewhere deep in that speech, a real son. I could hear him in there, behind the argument. That was the most painful part of the whole 40 minutes. Not Tara's performance, but Daniel's accidental sincerity. It would have been easier if there had been nothing left to grieve, but grief and resolution are not mutually exclusive. I had learned that much. Daniel, I said quietly, the people I have chosen are not strangers. They are people who showed up. The distinction matters. He looked away. Tara, sensing the moment was slipping, tried a final approach. She mentioned, with careful casualness, that Bradley Foss, their attorney, had advised them that certain estate changes made under demonstrable emotional distress could potentially be revisited. She said she wasn't threatening anything. She just wanted me to understand my options. I let the silence sit for a beat after she finished. Tara, I said, you have given a very thoughtful speech. I want to acknowledge that. She started to say something, but I continued. My decisions are made. They are legal, they are final, and they have been witnessed and notarized. My attorney is aware of the full context of why they were made, including the conversation at this kitchen table in September. If you have concerns about my mental competency, you're welcome to pursue that legally. Warren will be able to advise you on how likely that is to succeed. I paused. Is there anything else? Tara's composure did not shatter, but it cracked. A small, visible cracking, like a plate that has been dropped and not yet broken. Her smile went slightly wrong at the edges, Daniel said, his voice strained. Mom, you are making a serious mistake. I've made my assessment, I said. Thank you both for coming. I went inside. I gathered Lily and Mason, held them each for an extra moment, and watched from the doorway as Daniel buckled them into the car. Tara walked to the passenger side without looking back at me. The car backed out of the driveway and was gone. I stood in my hallway alone, and I noticed something. My hands were trembling slightly. Not from weakness, I want to be precise about that, but from the particular physical aftermath of sustained tension, the body releasing what the mind had been holding still. And underneath the trembling was something else. A deep, clear, almost mineral steadiness. The fear was real, but it was not larger than my resolve. It was smaller. 2 weeks after that Saturday, Warren Holt called me. Margaret, he said, I've received a letter from an attorney named Bradley Foss, representing your son Daniel and his wife. They are requesting access to your recent estate documents on the grounds that they have concerns about your testamentary capacity, meaning your ability to make legally sound decisions. They're suggesting that your revisions were made under psychological duress and may not reflect your genuine intentions. I was sitting in Gerald's chair. I looked at the morning light on the far wall for a moment. What do you need from me? I said. I'd like you to come in, Warren said. And I'd suggest we also arrange for a brief cognitive assessment with your physician, Dr. Harmon, as a precautionary measure. It's standard practice when capacity is questioned, and having a clean assessment on record will preemptively close this door. I'll call Dr. Harmon today, I said. I saw Dr. Harmon 2 days later. The cognitive assessment took 45 minutes. It was not particularly difficult. Memory exercises, sequential reasoning, a brief, structured interview. Dr. Harmon, who had been my doctor for 16 years, administered it with a professional neutrality that I appreciated, and then told me at the end that my results were excellent and that she would provide written documentation to Warren. She also said, quietly, before I left, Margaret, for what it's worth, you seem to me like someone who knows exactly what she's doing. I do, I said. The following Thursday, Warren had arranged a meeting. In his conference room, me, Warren, and, on the other side of the table, Daniel, Tara, and their attorney, Bradley Foss. Foss was a youngish man in an expensive suit who had clearly been well briefed and was working to project authority. Daniel was in a dark jacket and looked, I noticed, tired, in a way that went beyond a bad night's sleep. Tired in the way people look when they have been running a story that is starting to cost them more than they expected. Tara was impeccable, as always. But there was something in the set of her shoulders that was different from the woman who had stood in my garden 2 weeks earlier. Tighter, less certain of the ground. Warren opened by presenting the documentation: the signed will, the notarized trust documents, the certificate of independent legal counsel, and Dr. Harmon's written assessment of full testamentary capacity. He placed each item on the table with the quiet efficiency of someone laying cards, and he let the room understand what it was looking at. Foss began his counter-argument. He raised the question of emotional pressure, of hasty decisions, of potential undue influence from third parties. Here, he glanced obliquely at the mention of James and the literacy nonprofit in the documents, as though a bequest to charity were evidence of manipulation. He used careful, measured language, the language of a man building something slowly. But every point he raised, Warren had anticipated. The preparation had been thorough, and it showed. Warren dismantled each point methodically. I said very little. I had decided before arriving that I would let the documents speak and Warren argue, and that I would speak only when there was something important to add. So I sat with my hands folded on the table, and I watched the room. What I watched most carefully was Tara. She had been quiet for the first 30 minutes, and her silence was doing a kind of work. She was the still point in the room, composed, waiting. I recognized the tactic because I had seen it in my classroom for 26 years. The student who says nothing and lets others speak, conserving their moment. She was waiting for the argument to open a door she could walk through. It was Foss's stumble that gave her the opening. When Warren produced the timeline of my attorney visits alongside the locksmith invoice, Foss fumbled briefly trying to contextualize it, and in that small gap, Tara leaned forward. She said, with an edge in her voice that she could no longer entirely contain, "Margaret, we know you met with your attorney the same week you got the appraisal on Birchwood done. Don't you think that looks like this was planned?" The room went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something irreversible has just been said. Warren looked at Tara. Foss looked at Tara. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, not dramatically, just a single slow blink, the expression of a man who has just watched something he cannot take back. Because the appraisal on Birchwood Avenue had been done privately through a firm I had contacted on my own, communicated only to my personal cell phone. I had told no one. There was no way to know about it unless someone had gone through my files. I looked at Tara calmly. "How do you know about the Birchwood appraisal?" I said. Her expression flickered. "Daniel must have mentioned." "Daniel didn't know," I said. "I hadn't told anyone. The appraisal company contacted me directly at my personal number. There was nothing in writing at the house except the appraisal document itself, in the filing cabinet in my study." I let that land. "The filing cabinet," I added. That was not fully closed when I returned home from breakfast on the morning of September 26th. The silence in Warren's conference room was of the kind that has weight and texture. Foss put a hand on Tara's arm, slightly too quickly. A lawyer's instinct, stopping a witness from continuing. Daniel was looking at the table with the fixed attention of a man who has discovered that the floor is less solid than he believed. Tara said nothing more. The performance was over. What was left in her place was something stripped of its finish, defensive, cornered, small in the way that people who have operated through manipulation become small when the manipulation stops working. For the first time since I had known her, Tara looked her actual age. Warren said, in a tone of absolute composure, "Margaret, would you like to note for the record that this exchange confirms unauthorized access to your private documents, consistent with the filing cabinet incident and the changed locks you reported to me in September?" "Yes," I said. "I would like that noted." Foss called for a brief recess. He spent 4 minutes in the hallway with Daniel and Tara. When they came back, his manner had changed entirely. The architecture of authority he had walked in with was gone, replaced by the careful neutrality of a man managing a retreat. He said they would be withdrawing the challenge to testamentary capacity. He said his clients wished to resolve the matter privately. I said there was nothing left to resolve. I gathered my things, thanked Warren, and walked out of that conference room into a clear October afternoon with the firm and final knowledge that the hardest part was over. Warren followed up with a formal written response to Bradley Foss's firm that same afternoon, citing the complete documentation and noting explicitly that any further attempts to challenge the will on capacity grounds would be met with a full accounting of the September break-in, including the disturbed filing cabinet and the timeline confirming Daniel had a key. The letter was precise, factual, and absolute in its implications without being theatrical. That was Warren's particular gift. Bradley Foss did not respond. The challenge was officially withdrawn in writing 3 days later. I will be honest. I waited for some secondary consequence, another approach, another strategy. People who have operated through pressure rarely give up cleanly. But in the days that followed, the silence from Daniel and Tara was complete. I understood why. They had exposed themselves in that conference room in a way that could not be undone. Tara's knowledge of the Birchwood appraisal had confirmed the break-in as clearly as a fingerprint. Pursuing the matter further would have meant inviting scrutiny they could not afford. Daniel called me once, about 2 weeks after the meeting. I answered because I had decided I would always answer. I was not hiding, and I had nothing to hide. His voice was flattened in a way I hadn't heard before, scraped clean of the pressure and performance of the previous months. He said he didn't want to argue. He said he understood things had changed. He said he hoped I was all right. I told him I was well. I asked after Mason and Lily. He said they were fine. There was a pause that lasted several seconds and contained, I thought, a great deal that neither of us said. Then he said, I said something terrible to you. I waited. I'm not sure I can explain it, he said. I'm not sure there's an explanation that makes it okay. There isn't, I said, but I appreciate you saying so. We did not make plans. We did not suddenly reconcile into the family we had never quite been. That would have been fiction, and I was living my life, not writing it. What we had, after that call, was a kind of honest distance. Not warmth, but not warfare either. A permanent alteration in the landscape acknowledged by both of us. The legal matters resolved themselves quietly after that. The Living Trust for the Literacy nonprofit was formally established in November, with James named as the organizational contact. Warren finalized the transfer of the Birchwood deed into the trust structure. Claire received formal notification of her place in the will and called me, briefly and quietly, to say thank you, and to say she hoped I would live to be 102 and that the whole thing would be entirely irrelevant for decades. I told her I intended to try. What I had not entirely anticipated was the reaction of people outside the immediate family. Word travels in a small town. Not the specific legal details, those stayed private, but the general shape of what had happened. That Margaret Whitfield had revised her estate plan and stood her ground against family pressure. Dorothy knew most of it because I had told her. James knew his portion. Several people at my church had heard something, though the details blurred in the retelling, as they always do. What I found, unexpectedly, was that people wanted to talk about it. Not in a gossipy way, but in the way that people reach towards stories that reflect something they have been thinking about privately. 3 women from my church, women I had known for years, women in their 60s and 70s, took me to lunch in November and said, in various gentle ways that they were thinking about their own situations, their own documents, their own unexamined assumptions about what family meant and what obligation looked like. I told them what Warren had told me, that a will is not a promise and not a punishment. It is simply a document, and the only meaningful question about it is whether it accurately reflects your values. The lunch lasted 3 hours. We talked about our lives, the real shape of our lives, not the performed versions. By the end of it, I felt, as I had not felt in years, fully seen. That autumn, I also made an appointment with a local family mediator. Not because there was conflict left to mediate, but because I wanted to establish a formal, limited framework for maintaining my relationship with Mason and Lily. I was not willing to lose my grandchildren over the failures of their parents, and I was not willing to use them as leverage in the opposite direction. The mediator helped me draft a simple letter to Daniel proposing quarterly visits, structured, neutral, conducted in a way that served the children first. Daniel agreed after a week's silence, without negotiation. The first visit was in December. We went to the botanical garden. Mason found a praying mantis on a bench and spent 20 minutes studying it with the focused attention of a boy who might become a scientist. Lily held my hand and told me, unprompted, that Grammy Maggie smelled like flowers. I did not cry until I was in the car driving home, but they were the right kind of tears. Life, after a storm, does not return to what it was. It settles into a new shape, different, sometimes better, always more honest about its own outlines. The following year was the first in a long while that I lived on my own terms, entirely. I started volunteering at the Literacy Center on Thursday mornings. James had mentioned gently that they always needed readers for the children's program, and I had shown up one Thursday in January, mostly out of curiosity, and never stopped. There was a small boy named Elijah, 6 years old, who hadn't yet found the book that would open the door. I found it for him, a battered copy of Charlotte's Web that had been on the center's shelf for 10 years. The day he finished it, he sat very still for a moment, then looked up at me and said, "Is that what happens? When you love something?" I told him yes, that was exactly what happened. I traveled that year too, something I had not done since Gerald died. Dorothy's daughter lived in Portland, Oregon, and Dorothy had been talking about visiting for 2 years without ever quite going. I told her we were going in April, booked the flights, and we spent 8 days on the Oregon coast eating excellent seafood and walking on beaches that were nothing like Tennessee. I sent postcards to Claire, James, Dr. Harmon, and Warren Holt, who replied with a brief formal note saying he hoped the trip was restorative, which for Warren was the equivalent of a standing ovation. I did not send one to Daniel. That was not cruelty. It was proportion. My garden had its best year. The rose bushes Gerald had planted in 1987 bloomed in June with an abundance that startled me. Deep red, heavy-headed, almost extravagant against the white of the house. A neighbor I had barely spoken to before, a young woman named Priya, who had moved in 2 doors down with her husband and infant daughter, knocked on my door to ask the name of the variety. We ended up talking for an hour on the porch, and she began bringing the baby by on Saturday mornings. The baby's name was Nadia, and she had an expression of absolute concentrated seriousness that I found enormously funny and endearing. This is what I want you to understand about that year. It was not the year of grand events. It was the year of real ones. The distinction matters. As for Daniel and Tara, I know what happened because Franklin is small and because Claire kept me informed without making it her purpose to do so. The commercial real estate firm where Daniel worked underwent a significant restructuring in the spring. His division was reduced, and he was offered a lateral move to a smaller Memphis office or a buyout. He took the buyout. I suspect Tara's urgency about my assets had always been partly a hedge against their own financial uncertainty. They sold the house in the good neighborhood and moved to a smaller one. Tara returned to work in pharmaceutical sales. The comfortable life they had been building, the one that had apparently required a significant inheritance to sustain, became considerably more constrained. Daniel called me in the summer to tell me about the job situation. He did not ask for anything. I said I was sorry to hear it, and I meant that in the straightforward human sense. But I also sat with the knowledge that their difficulties had nothing to do with my decisions. They were the product of choices they had made, a life constructed on assumptions that had not held. They were not victims of my will. They were the product of their own. Mason and Lily came to visit in the summer, alone for the first time. Daniel dropped them off on a Friday, and I had them for the weekend. We baked. We built a birdhouse from a kit Mason had chosen. Lily lost a tooth at my kitchen table and was enormously proud of this, and we placed it carefully in a small envelope for the tooth fairy with all the solemnity the occasion required. Those 2 days were among the best I had that year. I am 72 years old now, and I live on Clover Creek Road, and the mockingbird is still in the oak tree by the back fence. In the mornings, I sit in Gerald's chair with my coffee and listen to it cycle through its repertoire: cardinal, wren, sparrow, something unnamed. And I think that Gerald was right about that bird. It is honest. It never pretends to be only one thing. I have tried, in the past year, to be the same. They say family is everything. I used to believe that without questioning it. Now I believe something more precise. Love is everything. Family is just a word for who you were born near. What I learned is this: your life, your home, your choices belong to you alone. No one is owed them simply because they share your name. If your child told you what mine told me, what would you have done? Would you have stayed silent? Or would you have picked up the pen? Tell me in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, please share it. Thank you for listening.